Thank you everyone for joining us. We're just admitting all the participants to the webinar and we'll be getting the event underway in just a moment. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, the land right beneath my feet belongs to the community once known as the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today virtually to celebrate the publication of Synaptic, the latest collection of poetry by Alison Calder, published by the University of Regina Press. I'd like to greet all of you here with us in the Zoom webinar. I'd also like to greet all of you watching on YouTube, both now and in the future. Thank you all so very much for joining us. I'll be putting some of this information in the chat in just a moment, but I did just want to go over a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The first is that following my housekeeping notes, I'll be introducing Alison Calder, who will then read for you. Following that, there'll be a conversation hosted by Vanessa Warne. After that, there'll be the opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So over the course of the evening, as questions occur to you, please do feel free to write them just in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please rest assured you will not interrupt us when you write in your question, and keeping all the questions in the Q&A box, ensure that tonight's moderator can find them very easily when it comes time to interrogate Alison about her collection. In addition, there is a live chat, so please do continue to say very lovely things about tonight's participants in that chat. Because we don't want to split everybody's attention, that won't be directly interacted with by Dr. Calder and Vanessa Warne, but they will be able to see everything when I pass all the comments along to them following the event. So please do feel free to put any of your comments in there. In addition to that, I would like to encourage you to pick up a copy of this incredible collection. So please do get in touch with us, either come into the store itself, give us a call, or order a copy of the book online. And regardless of where you are, we will find a way to get a copy of this book into your hands. But now that is more than enough for me. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the book and also about tonight's featured guest. So Synaptic is an evocative, deceptively complex collection of poems that ruminates on the inner workings of the brain, language, and the state of human curiosity in the age of information. In this intricate work, Calder asks us to think about the way we perceive and the ways in which we seek to know ourselves and others, touching on selkies and trolls along the way. Back in 2017, we had the pleasure of launching this book or parts of this book, when it was published as a chapbook called Connectomics. So some of the poems that are included in that portion of the book were launched at that point. That has been expanded for the book, and that was such a thrilling collection. This is such an incredibly thrilling collection that I can't wait to hear Alison read more from it. As you'll see, there's a quote from Alice Major on the back that says, Calder displays a wonderful ear for the sounds of language, from the diction of science to the phrasing of fairy tales. Tim Lilburn calls this a powerful upending achievement. It is a fantastic book, and I sincerely hope you all get a chance to get a copy and spend a lot of time with it. Now, our guest of honor tonight, Alison Calder, grew up in Saskatoon. Her poetry has won 2 Manitoba Book Awards and been a finalist for both the Gerald Lampert Award and the Lowther Award. Synaptic is her 3rd collection, following The Wonderful Wolf Tree and In the Tiger Park. She now lives in Winnipeg, where she teaches Canadian literature and creative writing at the University of Manitoba. So please join me in virtually welcoming Alison Calder.
Thanks so much, John. I always think that the real reason for writing a book is just to get John to talk about it. It's always such a treat. So first of all, thank you all for being here. I'm quite excited about this, as you can probably tell. First of all, I want to thank the University of Regina Press for making such a gorgeous book. I especially want to thank my editor, Randy Lundy, who was very helpful as an editor. We have different philosophies about line breaks, I think, but we managed to make it work. And I think the collection is what it is, partly because of him and his very clear way of putting things. I want to thank my family and friends for coming. and basically for being supportive and nice people for many years. I want to give special thanks to Ariel Gordon and Carrie Ryan, who were very helpful when I was thinking about the Connectomics series, and they spent a lot of time listening to and talking about it with me. And we need to start getting together again this summer once we can hang out in the backyard. I'm looking forward to that. Who else do I want to thank especially? You'll have to buy the book to see if I mention you in the back. I want to thank Warren, of course, for too much, actually. I want to thank him for too much. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And I want to thank Vanessa for the conversation we're going to have, and I'm so looking forward to it. Now, I want to just sort of get on and talk about the book, I guess. Now, this book was written pre-pandemic. It's a little bit pandemic-y, actually, in some of the poems I find. So I think anything published now is always going to be inflected by the last 2 years. The book is in sort of two halves, right? The first half is the Connectomics series, and the second half, which is called Other Fires, are the more, I guess, straight out lyric poems, where I'm dealing with things like, I don't know, art, philosophy, religion, dead whales, trolls, all kinds of other things that will crop up, I think, as we talk tonight. Now, Connectomics was published in a number of versions. They originally came out in 3 poems, which were published in CV2. It came out as a series of 12 poems that were published in a handmade illustrated chapbook by Jack Pine Press in Saskatoon. And it also came out as a series of 23 poems published by Iron Press in the UK. And that was also illustrated. And that might be the version that some of you are familiar with. Now, I still had more to say, believe it or not, about science and the language of science and how we approach it and how it approaches us, I guess. So there are now, I think, 33 poems in that series that are in this collection now. And they're all sort of riffs on the language of science, like I said, and how we try to know ourselves, right? And the ways in which we remember or forget our limits, I guess, in our quest to find out who we are. It also contains, I think, the only poems in existence about Tri-Council research funding. So if that's your special interest, go for it. They're in there for you. The poems in the Connectomics section have, each of them has a footnote attached to them, and in the footnote is the scientific information, and then in the poem itself is the sort of the more lyric exploration of that. So you can sort of see where, I guess, where the idea comes from for the poem, and see what kind of gloss I'm doing on what the science is telling us. There's a mistake in one of the footnotes. I'm not going to tell you where it is. You can find it yourself. But if you find it, just remember, I already know. Don't tell me. I don't want to hear anything else. The second part of the book, as I said, is more straight out lyric poems. I do feel I need to remind people sometimes, as I do with my class, that the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the author. Basically, like many writers, or all writers, maybe I'm a bit of a big liar when it comes to writing about my personal thoughts and feelings about things. Some of you may spot yourselves in here, and just know that if you do, it's a mark of great love. It means I'm paying attention to you, whether or not you want that to happen. Yeah, so there's 2 halves of the book, as I said. I think they are actually connected in a number of different ways, and I'll be interested to think about that as we go along. Yeah, so I'm going to start off with the opening part of the book. So I'm going to read about 8 or 9 poems, I think. Apologize for looking down. I haven't got them memorized. So what I'm going to do is read the title of the poem, and then I'm going to read the footnote, which is sort of the explanatory note, and then I'll read you the poem. So I'm going to start off with the first poem, Connectomics. Footnote tells me that, roughly speaking, the goal of Connectomics is to improve ways to map the neural connections in the brain. Connectomics. The idea is to render the brain transparent enough to read through, trickles of water washing away thought. Deletions, insertions, translocations, inversions, proofreaders' symbols carve a straight line to the Minotaur. In the light of the laboratory, thought's skein unravels, bumpy road smoothed. Lucent, pellucid, The brain wavers like the glass in a display case, minimum interference between eye and page. Like reading through a jellyfish. The text, however, remains opaque. So when I was doing the research for the book, I was reading around, mostly through Google, frankly, as I think anyway, Google's become my friend more and more over the past few years. And I was basically following up all the little trails that were being left in terms of the kind of imagery that science was using to talk about itself, the sort of ideas of the way that it conceived the world. Because if a scientist, right, is trying to explain things to lay people, they can't just tell you something straight out. Right? They have to use comparisons, they have to use metaphors, they have to tell us things that will help us to understand. So I myself, obviously not a neuroscientist, but I'm fascinated by this discourse, the way that science works to explain itself, I guess. And I don't think the way science works to explain itself is so different, perhaps, than the way poetry works to explain itself. But I'm going to read the third poem here, which is called C. elegans. And the footnote tells me that C. elegans is a small soil-dwelling nematode. It was the first animal to have its genome completely sequenced. 40% of its genome is identical to that of humans. All 959 somatic cells of its transparent body are visible under a microscope. And so here we go, writing from the point of view of a nematode. C. elegans. You call us simple. On TV, innocents scream at cartoon germs, brandish cleansers, scrub us away. Grade 6 science classes learn what's living in their lashes, are traumatized for life. Still, I have what you need. Complicated, tractable, I am the ideal compromise between like and not. I'm useful because I die quickly. Your funding agencies approve. Plumbing for secrets in my glassy body, you peer through my window, seeking 40% of your soul. How age, how sleep, how want, the fundamental mysteries of biology hidden in plain sight. The manual says, keep your samples separate from your culture. But let me reverse your gaze, turn the microscope upon the viewer. My elegant curves, the symmetries of my crystalline motility, mesmerize. Rotund, rotating, I root into regions you've not been to. My eyeless face recognizes light. Hermaphrodite, I love myself. Non-hazardous, non-infectious, non-pathogenic, non-parasitic, of no economic importance. I'm nothing that you are. So I'm going to flip now to some of the newer poems in the series. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go to a poem called Cryptic Maladaptation. And I find that as I get further along in the series, the footnotes actually start to getting longer and longer. This one, fortunately, is a bit, it only has one sentence. And so what is cryptic maladaptation? The footnote tells us that cryptic maladaptation is a hidden genetic vulnerability only exposed by unknown and extreme future events. Cryptic maladaptation. Tea, not coffee. Gin, not rum. Still, not sparkling. In high school, typing instead of German. Was it that? Reading, thinking, impossible to parse the sentence, looping cause and effect. Was it turning left, not right? Standing up, not sitting down, that caused that butterfly to flap its wings? Coke or Pepsi? Fries or salad? Somewhere, a tipping point, snowpack shifting, far off growl that I don't yet hear. So related to the cryptic maladaptation is, and here's what I mean about the footnotes like getting longer and longer. The poem is called the Anachronic Principle, or the fragility of good things. And so the Anachronic Principle gets its name from Tolstoy's novel, which opens with the line, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The principle indicates that while successful adaptations within a group are all alike, maladaptations can happen in myriad ways. In catastrophe theory, this appears as the principle of the fragility of good things, where good things, which require a number of elements to be coordinated in order to exist, are more fragile than bad things, which have the power to cause chaos. So, the Anachronic Principle, the fragility of good things. Finally, proof of what you always suspected. There are more rainy days than sunny ones. The grass was greener somewhere else. Your brother got the bigger piece. You won't be promoted or married for long. Divorce is in the stacked cards. Cakes are mostly burnt. Broths are mostly spoiled. The fish don't bite more often than they do. Your bus is the last to come. Other lines move faster. Other people's dogs bark less. Other cats purr more. You drop more stitches than you knit. Still, you're bound to win if you bet against yourself. And I'm going to finish off the Connectomics series here with a poem called The Modified Anachronic Principle. So the modified Anachronic Principle suggests that although maladaptations are all different, they follow the same structures. So to investigate this similarity, scientists brought together studies of groups of humans, animals, trees, grassy plants, stock market prices, and changes in the banking sector. Yes. Anyway, here's a poem about that logic. The modified Anachronic Principle. Salt is pepper, hawks are handsaws, the living are the dead. We act like money, everyone holding hands in the middle of the Venn diagram. Nothing metaphysical now about the yoking of dissimilars, rough edges all ground into a smoothie. We move as a herd, a happy family. The grass is the same green everywhere, animals ubiquitous, birds flocking together. Everyone's hemlines rise and fall, bulls lying down with the bears. Forget the trees, look at the forest. This murmuration, everyone asking for directions at the same time. So I'm going to turn to the second part of the book, to a cheery poem. So yeah, so I'm getting old. So are you. We're all getting old. And I turned 50. So the poem is called At 50. Here's a 50-year-old poem. That's not quite what I mean. You guys know what I mean. Of course, now I'm like, oh, 50, remember that? I was so happy then. Anyway, at 50. At 50, my body says, fuck it. I'm not following rules anymore. 1 foot on the dock, 1 foot in a canoe, a tipping point, 2 halves of a pill capsule broken open. This is it, the beginning of the long dash. My skin sprouts wires, warts. I'm fat and bony at the same time. Aphasic, I've discarded conjunctions, speak only in aphorism, a crone's gnomic utterance. Knees, long silent, start to talk. The body's chorus shouts discordantly, spine a separating zipper. I am my own uncanny double, zombie, Frankenstein's creation with dissolving stitches. Each morning I rise from the dead, accompanied by creaks and groans. All day I lurch from point to point, car with timing belt about to go. Live fast, die young. Too late. Instead, I'll coddle my corpse to be, prescribed, medicated, moisturized, massaged, monstrous, and cool with that. So let me continue on with a cheery poem called The Future. Oh, Alison, anyway, The Future. The future is peevish and elderly. I should apologize if you are peevish and elderly. The poem's not about you. The future is peevish and elderly. You should have started moisturizing your neck. Why did you spend that money on coffee? Hindsight's a curse, an endless complaint. You shouldn't have stopped flossing, should have exercised more. The past, errant child, is an endless disappointment that never makes the grade, burning all its bridges before it comes to them. Those second bottles of wine were bad ideas, as was that second marriage. Who decided to put birth control pills down the toilet? Easier to say no to resistance, earbuds blocking the anticipated lecture. No one really wants to see the future. One wrist slap after another, disaster's starting point on the horizon in the rearview mirror. Well, that wasn't very cheery, was it? So I'm going to read a poem about being up at the cabin. And in this poem, I'm trying to describe a sound. And the challenge that I have is that I'm trying to describe a sound without talking about sound. So you guys can judge whether that works or not. It's called Opening. We were goofing around on the road behind the cabin, taking photos when the night fell open. Wolves. Howling isn't the word for it. There is no word for it. The way molasses looks when you pour it, thick, glossy, thinning to a point before widening out again, that's how it sounds. Or like running your fingers over a piece of silk so that the fabric is perfect, but you feel every flaw in your own skin. We tried recording sound, but all we got was noise, a narrow slice, wood squealing when the axe rips it open. What did it sound like? Like there was a hole and we couldn't throw enough into it to fill it up. So I just have two more. And I'm going to read this one actually for Vanessa, with her interest in museum studies, a poem called Melt. You know, it's about glaciers melting. It's another really upbeat little ditty. Melt. Ice melts and the bodies appear. 5,000 years ago or 50, they come out just as they went in. The glacier's tongue retreats, speaking grief. The past still wears its boots. The screes are lost and found upended, accidental specimens strewn across the slope, a climber on K2, a couple milking cows, passengers on a final flight, equally preserved. Without an editor, everything's a clue, mysterious forests hidden by the trees. The ice, bad curator, releases exhibits randomly for us to pounce on. Think of all we learn, the world a little more transparent with each degree. Greedy, we peer at stars without a constellation, our breath fogging the glass of the display case. Why know everything? Because it's there. So I'm going to finish off with the last poem in the book. I started with the first one, so I'll finish with the last poem. The last poem also has a footnote, or an endnote rather. The poem is called At el Santuario de Chimaya, which means at the sanctuary in Chimaya, basically. The sanctuary, one of the most important Catholic pilgrimage sites in North America, is located just outside the town of Chimaya, New Mexico. A miraculous cross was unearthed on this site in 1810, and it is said that dirt from the hole in which the cross was found has healing powers. Oh, and I have some of the dirt. I was going to do a show and tell. Anyway, next book. Yes, I think that's what you need to know. Pilgrimage site, magic dirt. Okay. Chimaya was for crazy people, the kind who think you can go somewhere on crutches and be healed, the kind who believe in God. We went there for the chain link fences weighed down with rosaries, the outdoor shrines deluged by stacks of fabric, candles, other cheap, shiny things. For the hole in the floor with magic healing dirt, replenished twice daily, presided over by a miraculous crucifix. Clearly, this was nuts. My brother was in the hospital for his 7th surgery. I texted, joking, promising to get him dirt if he promised to eat it. Wikipedia said that would work. Coming up from the parking lot, we passed loose piles of wooden crosses, tossed to the side like discarded stage props. Primitive offerings hung from the fence, God's eyes made of twigs and string, crosses built from bent nails and wire, strips from people's clothes, one step up from animal sacrifice. A statue showed a white man teaching an Indian how to worship. We moved from the 7 days creation picnic area to the portal of illumination, traversing geography outlined by zealots. Inside, the church was cold but beautiful, flowers frescoed on the altar, stations of the cross outlined on whitewashed walls. Candles in 2 corners offered warmth. I wandered slowly. It was getting hard to breathe. I could feel my chest compress, hoped I wasn't having a conversion experience or allergy attack. A small door beside the altar. Ducking through, we faced a wall of crutches, walkers, braces, grouped and stacked to the roof. The other side was an explosion of photos, big, small, so many faces, children, old people, hospitals, ball diamonds, motorcycles, pajamas, school pictures, floor to ceiling, wall to wall. I couldn't speak or breathe, couldn't look at other people. The dirt room was no bigger than a closet. Inside, a blowhard mansplained miracles. I squeezed in. The room was hot. The walls were close. I wasn't in my body. My hands were shaking as I knelt. It was hard to unscrew the jar's lid. Important not to spill the magic dirt. Dust and rocks tipped into my container. The others fled from this confession. My desperation filled the room, pushing me outside, stricken, stuffing the jar into my pocket before anyone else knew. And that's the end of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was marvelous. Now that we've all splashed about in our impending mortality a little bit in such a wonderfully poetic way, I have the inestimable pleasure of introducing our host for this evening. Vanessa Warne teaches literature at the University of Manitoba. She is a book reviewer for the Winnipeg Free Press, and she co-hosts Victorian Samplings, the podcast of the Crafting Communities Project. So, Vanessa Warne.
Thanks so much, John. Congratulations, Alison, on this wonderful new collection. And thank you so much for this chance to chat with you and for your reading tonight. As you know, I am a regular rereader of both Wolf Tree and In the Tiger Park, and I am so glad to have this new body of work by you, this very provocative body of work by you to add into the mix. I'm wondering if I could ask a question about vocabulary first. So for years now, you've made me feel less at home with words I thought I knew. You've defamiliarized language for me time and time again, but you're really challenging me this time because you're bringing in for all of your readers a kind of surprising kind of vocabulary as you discuss brain science through this project. And I'm wondering about words like, I made a list, cortex, optogenetics, Wellbutrin. Can you tell us about your attraction to those words and what you're doing with this scientific vocabulary?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you said that, like the word surprise, because I think that's what I found too when I was starting to read about some of these things. And I was sort of tipped off by a colleague, Mike Shaw, in the biology department at the U of M, who was talking one day about how they had glow-in-the-dark mice. And I was like, glow-in-the-dark mice, all right. If I can't write a poem about that, I'm just not trying. So off I go down the rabbit hole to look for the mice. Is that even a thing? Oh, some poet I am. Anyway, so I go off looking for it. And what I discovered was that the scientific language was, the actual vocabulary is quite mystifying to someone like me who doesn't know it. But the words around that, like the context in which the words have to be located in order to make sense, right, I found very surprising and quite wonderful, right? And I'm really drawn to writers who take language from one place where it lives and put it into a different place, right? Because the different places have different ways of speaking. We know this, right? And I think when we inhabit the same language all the time, we take it for granted, and we stop seeing in many times, like the pun. We don't see the other direction the word could go in, that it's actually wanting us to go in some kinds of ways. So I think by looking at things that are just so weird to me, like out of my experience, and then becoming a little more familiar with them, I'm sort of opening up. Well, ideally, I guess what I would be doing would be opening up some of that language, right? And sort of just putting a different spin on it. But I find that when I come back to where I am, that I'm also looking at those words differently as well. So I find them mutually enriching. I think the people think about art and science where it's very convenient to think about them as like the right hand and the left hand. They're sort of opposite things, right? But I think, there's so much in common between the artist and the scientist, right? Both have to be creative, right? Both have to work really, really hard. Both have to have a kind of curiosity. about them. And I think looking at some of the words and the way that language works made me think more about that, and also more about the idea of certainty, right? Like I thought I knew what a word meant. Maybe I don't. Somebody thinks they know what, the brain looks like, do they? I kind of wonder about that, so yeah, I like to write about things that I don't know about very much, because I sort of find out more, or at least I think I find out more that way. So it's really a way of sort of looking at words that make me curious about things, and then seeing where they take me.
Well, you take us along with you, as readers of this book will discover. Can I talk to you a little bit, staying in Connectomics at the first half of the book, about footnoting, which you referenced, and you talked about that structure that you have of a footnote with every poem. And you also read some footnotes, and I was super interested to find out, would you read the footnote after the poem, before the poem? Would you obey your own footnote, which for people listening is attached to the title? I didn't know what was going to happen, because you've really offered us different, I think, routes through your poems. If we're going to be obedient and kind of read the footnote first, or could you just talk about maybe footnoting and poetry, or maybe the question is really footnoting as poetry?
Oh, I like that, footnoting as poetry. Yeah, well, for this book, I had to keep, the footnotes have a function, right? Which is telling people like what the hell I'm talking about, because otherwise they have no clue, right? Like,
it's true.
So there has to be some way of conveying that information to the reader. I can't just say like, go read these other 25 books and then come back here and read mine, So they're very practical in that way. But I like them as well because there's sort of a tension in the poems, right? I feel anyway, between like the sort of clinical term, I guess, or perhaps the more scientific definition of whatever I'm talking about, and then the way in which the poem itself is exploring that and taking it apart. And so I see like, we don't usually think about footnoting poems, right? Unless we're doing it for the Norton Anthology or whatever, because you have to teach it and you're, highlighting some illusion for your student or whatever. And so I thought it's just interesting formally, like bringing those things together. And it also solved it solves a layout problem as well, right? Because if you're gonna publish a book, like you have to actually make it digestible. And I know when the Connectomics series was in its chapbook incarnation with Jackpine Press, where it's sort of hand designed, that it was very hard to figure out how that was going to happen, right? Because the way people read down the page certain ways, but like, I think it's interesting. Like you saying that makes me think about like the decisions that you make all the time as a poetry reader, like, as opposed to like the poem when it's read out loud is different than the poem on the page. And so when you're reading out loud, you have to make all kinds of decisions about like when you get to the line break, for example, are you just going to charge ahead like it's still the same sentence, or are you going to have this like long pregnant pause, or what are you going to do? And I think, just ways of, ways of foregrounding, having to make choices, I guess, is kind of interesting. And I like, the footnote is a scientific apparatus, right? And here it is attached to like this supposedly ephemeral, like, mushy poetry, right? And suddenly it's got this hard thing attached to it, a fact, right? So the idea of like the contrast between the fact and the poem, I find really interesting as well.
I love it too for the way it creates a conversation, between yourself and other voices. Like it imports these voices in such compelling ways, but also keeps them at the bottom of the page. It's super interesting. Could we talk about, as we're talking about kind of parts and how they connect, about the two parts of the book, which, as you've noted, are quite different in the sense that you give us this very focused, compelling engagement with the science of the brain. And then you give us this wonderful kind of miscellany from, as you noted, dead whales. I think John referenced trolls and selkies. I will think about university administrative bureaucracy, like it's all there. But I feel that they're so wonderfully connected by Alison Calder wit, like, but you probably see other points of connection, or do you not? Do they exist in two halves for you? No,
I do see connection. I think well, I mean, part of the connection is me, right?
Yes.
Like there's that, like just the way that I speak as a poet is there. The fascination with language is there. The fascination with kind of the weird. Like I just sort of like I like the weird thing, to write about it much more than the thing I approach head on, in a sense. I like to see something sort of from the side. But I think like in both of them, like the poems are about, in both halves, they're about looking at things, right? They're about looking at the world and trying to figure it out, right? In ways that are both good and bad. Like you want to find your place in the world, right? But I think, you know, oftentimes we have the desire to master the world in some ways, right? Which the poem Melt is sort of about, right? It's about that sort of like looking, like tearing things apart in order to like claim them or know them. And it's like, well, why? Why do you have to do that? You're not going to be able to, you know, you're just going to tear that apart. And what you're going to find there is frankly yourself, right? Because that's what you're looking for in the first place. So for me, I think like they're connected by this sort of like quest in a sense for something. I mean, the scientist is looking for something, right? Like the guy who says, you know, I want to map the entire brain. It's going to be wonderful when that happens, when I can sum everybody up. Like, isn't that going to be fabulous, right? That's maybe not so much different than the speaker at the end, you know, who's in the sanctuary having this very unexpected, like, crisis of faith, basically, you know, also looking and searching and wanting. So like to be able to contain everything, I guess. Like there's a lot of stuff about mapping in both sections. And I think we can, the idea of maps extend into a variety of different directions. So I think these are some of the things that bring it together. I like to think there's some sort of funny parts in both sections, you know, so.
Well, there's a great deal of wit. But could I just work with your idea of mapping here? Because I think people who are with us tonight, who love your poetry like I do, will be very sensitive to the geographical specificity of your poetry. You really bring us to very specific places and spaces. And there's a wonderful poem in this second half that takes us for a walk on the frozen Assiniboine River. But you take us lots of places. So did you want to talk about your engagement with different places and spaces in this collection?
Yeah, I'm actually still trying to figure that out. I find it so when I write, like my writing is really dependent on place in a variety of ways. And I don't mean that some kind of like, you know, I'm from the prairies, therefore I have to write a lot of flat poems, you know, that kind of thing. But I mean like the details that I use in my work, like come from my immediate environment. Right. So I could be writing about, like in Wolf Tree, I'm writing about a pig in the 18th century and like flags that, you know, he sees outside his window. Right. Well, those are the flags I see on the top of the building outside my window when I'm writing the poem. Right. So like it comes in like that. So because of the way the academic life works, like, I do a lot of my writing when I'm on research leave, because you can't get anything done during the year because you can't, at least I can't. And if you can, I just like, I don't like those people. But anyway, so, you know, the poems, in a weird way, like the poems that I write are determined by the places that I go. And I do really wonder, like if I didn't go to New Mexico, for example, on my last research leave and hang out there, what would I be writing about? Like I'd be writing about something. Like if I went to the Arctic, would I be writing Arctic poems? Yes, I would. And so then what would that look like? Like it's a weird way in which I feel like I'm not necessarily in control of where I'm going. And I don't mean that in any kind of like mystifying way. I mean, it's just weird. It's like it just happens that I turned right instead of left, right? And so therefore I saw this thing that I ended up writing about. But I feel like I'm a very detail-oriented poet. I really like details, and I like to sort of lard them on in the poem, which is why you can hear when I'm reading all these lists, right? I just love to pile stuff in there. And the details that I get from, you know, what I can see in my immediate area. And I think that's where the specificity comes from. But it is weird. Like, you know, if I went to different places, I would write different things. And what would those things be? You know, like, would they be the same? Would they be different? You know, well, we'll never know, right?
Well, just to be clear, I love your here and your away poems. So feel free to range or to ground yourself. I'm checking the time, and I made a promise not to natter on. I do see one intriguing and urgent question in the Q&A waiting for us. But before I do that, I will selfishly ask you about the last poem in the book and the last poem that you shared with us in your reading today at El Santuario. I hope I'm saying that right. De Chimaya. Thank you. You have the Spanish I lack. So, but I love this poem because I think it is representative for me of so many of your kind of distinctive traits as a poet. There's lots that's, definitively Calderian in there. So there's the wit. I made a list. There's the powerful evocation of place. There's your attention to objects and kind of the lives of objects, but there's also I will say the speakers, not your own, the speakers kind of relentless, honest self-depiction, right? And so I value all of those things, but I think this poem is so interesting to read, and maybe I am reading it through the lens of the pandemic, but this is a poem that is a very direct engagement with human suffering. And you end the book, and you ended the reading portion of tonight with this image of a shaking hand gathering dirt in a jar. And this feels both like very, very vulnerable and somehow hopeful to me. And I wondered if I could turn to you with those two words, vulnerable and hopeful in mind, or to just think about that last poem, which is very important, I think, for the way it closes this particular collection.
Thanks. Yeah, like I think vulnerable and hopeful is sort of what I would like to be. As this, like when I'm writing the poems, like as a speaker, right? Like the I in there is and is not me, obviously, right? Like I find for some reason or other, like I find poems where the speaker is like foregrounds their own flaws, I guess, much more interesting than ones where they don't, right? So like in that poem, like we've got the speaker who at the beginning is just like, oh yeah, I know these idiots, like, look at all this crazy shit that's going down. Like, it's all this like crazy, cartoon stuff. These people are obviously lunatics, right? And then like holy smoke, like I was wrong. Like that was like, what just happened? Like, I don't even have the vocabulary to describe that. So I think like that sort of moment of change, I guess, or that moment of revelation, I guess, is something that I'm really interested in. And I think like in a lot of my poems, my speakers are mistaken, like whether or not they know they're mistaken, like they're just flat out wrong, perhaps, or they do bad things. Or I just think like in the Tiger Park, I've got a poem about trying on PK Page's old clothes, in which I saw, by the way. Someday I'll tell that story. I actually did not try on PK Page's old clothes. In the poem, I try them on and they rip, and it's like a terrible thing, right? I would never rip PK Page's old clothes, right? But it's a much better poem if I do, right, than if I don't. So, and it's just that kind of hubris, like as if, anyway. I think like the speaker thinks they know it all, and they don't. And I think that is maybe what unites both parts of the book, I guess, or it's just a reminder to me always that I don't know it all. Because like, you and I both work at university, we are heavily invested in knowing things, like, and being experts on things, right? And we're expected to be experts on things. And we're not necessarily, or we're not, we can never be expert enough on things. And I think maybe that's where some of this preoccupation with knowledge and what knowledge is and what it means and how we do or do not have it, maybe that's where some of that comes from.
Thank you for all you just shared. And I would just differ with you on your claim that you don't have the vocabulary, because you do. And I have the proof right here. Okay, I need to turn now. If the with you, Alison, and with John. And I thank you again for everything that you so generously shared in answering my questions. I need to turn to a pressing question we've received from the audience. And it goes as such. Just wondering if you could speak about your family, specifically your brothers, and the influence they have had on your writings, and really your whole life in general. And I hope I gave that reading as it was written. So,
wow, it's so hard. Who could have written such a thing? I can't even imagine. Can I speak about their influence? No. No, I can. But not their influence. I mean, like, yeah, sure, like, whatever. They're my brothers. We grew up together. They're pains in the butt. What can you do? But like the people around me, like whether or not they are like my immediate family or whether they're acquaintances or whatever, are people that I guess I'm like, I've got a poem in Synaptic about being on the subway and being crowded on the subway, and like I'm holding onto the same rail as everybody else. And I suddenly realized like I'm connected to all these people. Like, and I don't want to be, because it's like gross and sweaty and like there's hair and stuff like this around. I don't want to touch it, right? But you know, we're all linked together, and that's there's a responsibility that comes with that, I guess. And so as far as my specific brothers go, you know, I will say that they are a source of material, right? They are a source of rage. Quite often, they're a source of fascination. You know, I love them. What can I do? I'm stuck with them. They're stuck with me. We're in it for the long haul.
I think that's a satisfactory answer to that question, if ever there was one. I see from Robin Gordon in the Q&A now, and I'll quote her, "I love your sense of wonder without spirituality per se. Do you think about that mix or balance? So wonder, spirituality."
Yes and no. I think, I mean, for me, like my sense of wonder is not grounded in spirituality, right? For other people, it may well be, right? For me, it's not there, but I don't think they're necessarily so far apart, I guess. I think, well, that's actually a really interesting question that I have to think more about giving some kind of satisfactory answer to. But I guess it's about the idea of faith, really. Like whether that faith is grounded in some kind of religious faith or whether there's just like hope, like in general, like hope that humanity is going to do the right thing, or hope that, you know, something good will come of all of this, right? Like I think I would maybe link those things through the idea of hope, I guess, like knowing that you're going to be wrong, like you're going to be slapped down, but you have to keep on hoping, right? It's why I work for the union.
We could talk
Right.
about, we could talk about, yeah, we could talk about
story.
A whole other story, but touched on importantly in this text. I see we're happy that you said the word union in the chat. So great. On that subject though of wonder, like I think, Alison, it's super interesting the way that wonder surfaces in relationship to the scientific in this collection. And then wonder also surfaces in relationship to kind of folklore and fairy tale, which have been really important to your work. And I hear wonderful and much valued by me echoes of earlier poems by you from your previous collections here on that note. But I note the time, and I want to perhaps invite John to join us again. And thank you, Alison. It's been so lovely, and I feel so fortunate to be among the first readers of this collection. And I congratulate you effusively for what you've achieved here. So over to you, John.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Vanessa. That was an incredible hosting job. And thank you so very much, Alison, for the reading, for all your comments on the book, and for writing this book in the first place. It's such an incredible read. And if you have not already, I would encourage all of you to run out and pick up a copy of Synaptic, published by the University of Regina Press. But I'd like to thank you all once again so very much for joining us here this evening. Those of you who joined us here on Zoom, those of you watching on YouTube now and in the future, I'd just like to ask you all to join me in one more round of gratitude. Again, to the University of Regina Press for the publication and sponsorship of this event, to Vanessa Warne for her inestimable hosting, and of course, to Alison Calder, who absolutely did not rip PK Page's clothes for all of her incredible writing. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.